Welcome to Magnificast, a podcast about usurping Joel Osteen's spot on iTunes podcast hierarchy and also Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt. I'm a professor at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois. My research interests are media archaeology, leftist politics, and big gulps. I ditched the LaCroix this week, and I got a big gulp.
Nice.
So
that's good.
That's good.
I guess. I'm Dean, a Catholic PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto. My research interests are religion and technology, and I don't know. What else do I research? Nothing.
I don't know. But you got a backwards hat on, so you're sort of deep in that hat.
That's right. Yeah, that's true.
Day,
researching new ways of wearing hats. So this is a very particular angle today. Tomorrow's going to be different.
Ooh, what is that? 47 degrees?
Yeah. Well, 46 was just not my style. So.
Cool. Very good.
Literally
good
cool. This is what it means to be cool, to have a backwards hat on. Learn that from cartoons.
It's what it means to be cool if you are in a 90s sitcom.
Yeah, which I am, so.
Nice. Good for you.
Yeah, cue Seinfeld baseline.
All right. This week we're talking with Katie Grimes about her book, Fugitive Saints, a really neat book about saints, hagiographies, and their incredibly racist and bad histories. But it's a really cool book and a really important topic, and Katie is very cool, and you guys will enjoy the conversation we had with her, I think. But before we get that far, as usual, we're going to go through some new iTunes reviews because we just got a bunch of them. We got a bunch of them to read.
It's a good problem
and they're
to
good.
have.
So what? Yeah, I know. Probably should do a Twitter poll whether or not people actually like this, but I don't care. I like it. Okay, so first review, 5 out of 5 stars as usual. Okay, it says the title of the review, oh my gosh, is Reverse Exercising the Spectre of Communism into Your Ear Holes. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that sounds right. That's a good description.
We're putting that ghost into your brain.
Yeah, getting possessed by the spirit of communism.
I guess that's good. I guess it's a good thing. Okay, this is by username. Oh my gosh, stop. This is by username Millions of Dead Kulaks. Okay.
I don't even know if there were millions of kulaks.
But there are some dead ones for sure. Yikes. Yeah, I mean, I guess if you make your username something, like, I have to read it. I guess that's just the rule. I don't know. I don't support this, but I guess this is what people are doing now.
It's gonna be awesome when Ben Shapiro has this whole campaign to get you to read Donald Trump is great on our account the way that he does at Starbucks. Yeah.
Username Ben Shapiro is a fart. All right, fine. Anyways, this review says these good things about us: intelligent, engaging, and full of heart. So many hearts in here, filled to the brim with organs. This podcast delivers magnificently on its promise. Magnificently. The Magnificast shines in its refreshing balance of politics, theory, Christianity, and lukewarm takes. Matt and Dean exhibit great chemistry, and their candid, humble, and earnest conversations benefit from their easy friendship. One feels not so much that they're listening to a carefully constructed podcast. Oh, good, I guess.
You've discovered our secret.
But are being welcomed into a conversation. Yeah. Yeah, I think if you listen to this, you'll feel that this is not a carefully constructed podcast. But instead, you're being welcomed into a conversation amongst friends and comrades. That's what we're after here. While the hosts entertain and educate perfectly well on their own, the show's impressive assortment of guests adds a welcome diversity of voices and perspectives on the topics they discuss. I can honestly say that this podcast deserves a full 5 stars. Never before have I found myself so eagerly awaiting the publication of new episodes of a podcast. That's
nice.
Very nice. Thanks, guys, for what you're doing. Good stuff right there.
Yeah, I've never thought that lukewarm things were refreshing, but I'll give it a shot. I don't know. Maybe there's some refreshing lukewarm takes out there in the world.
like a nice room temperature bowl of soup.
Yeah, that's right. Real refreshed after that.
Okay, cool. Username Cinepunks. I know who that is. What's up? You guys check out the Cinepunks podcast. It's about movies and it's good. Just saying. Do it. Okay. Cinepunk says, the title of this is Essential Listening, 5 out of 5 stars. They say, engaging, fun, and thought-provoking, completely unique in scope and perspective. Yeah, I mean, I guess so. I still think that we are the only Christian left podcast out there.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, me too.
If we are wrong, I don't know, send us your contact info.
Like, let's hang out.
Yeah.
Okay, the final review for this week is entitled Necessary and Past Due. Splendid podcast for revolutionary proportions. This podcast review has both a title and a subtitle, so that's something.
Nice.
By username Friar Fleshbone the Fourth, 5 out of 5 stars.
I wonder what happened to the first 3.
Oh man, well,
blocked.
I don't know. Blocked. Okay. Friar Fleshbone the Fourth says, my beloved comrades have brought to the internet proper synthesis of ancient and medieval Christian tradition, modern leftist politics, which are inextricably connected and simply need to be remembered by the masses. They have taken the torch of religious liberation and made it freely available to all in a jargonless manner. The revolution is approaching, and these two gentlemen are assisting Christians in understanding how and why they must pick up their cross and whip and drive those who buy and sell out of sacred thoughts, out of sacred spaces. Joel Osteen, we're putting it on blast still. Hashtag Joel Osteen. Okay, the review continues, which, thanks to the incarnation, just so happens to be the entire earth. Let me read that.
I will let you read that again.
The revolution is approaching, and these two gentlemen are assisting Christians in understanding how and why they must pick up their cross and whip and drive those who buy and sell out of sacred spaces, which, thanks to the incarnation, just so happens to be the entire earth. This is also like a preamble to some type of like larger theological treatise, I believe, but there it is. And then, okay, this aspiring priest will point all to your podcast. Thanks for your work. Peace be with you. P.S. Acton Institute will be left in ruins. May we all sing praises on its rubble. Yeah, this is like a very good thing. Wow. Okay.
That's some real
this is good.
Real good sermonizing on iTunes reviews. I appreciate that a lot, actually.
Yeah. The end at the Acton Institute about the Acton Institute is good. Those guys, they still suck. So quick reminder, these reviews, maybe you hate this part of the podcast, but again, I like
too
them,
bad.
so whatever. Too bad. These reviews are really important to us because they help get us up there in the old iTunes algorithm. They help promote our podcast, and they help, most importantly, usurp Joel Osteen from the podcast boards, and they make us feel good and give us content to talk about on the show before we get to the rest of it. So
before we get to the
stuff.
good
So
part,
keep
we've got this part that you have to sit through. So keep sending us these reviews.
So anyways, yeah, keep sending us your reviews. Hashtag Joel Osteen. You guys have been on it this week. It was really good. Lots of good Joel Osteen stuff going on.
Do you think he's been like comforting himself reading it and thinking like, who's this Joel Nose teen? It's just big
Joel
big nose teenager.
Teen. No, he's a no-nose teenager. It's Joel Osteen. He's a teenager with no nose, noseless. All right, this part of the podcast is over now.
Yeah, we gotta shut this down real quick. So thanks again, Katie, for being on the podcast. We usually start out just chatting a little bit about how your week has been. I'll give you I'll ask Matt first how his week's been going, so you can have a chance to come up with something cooler than what he did.
It'll be easy.
Matt, what have you been up to?
It's the third week of class at my institution, and it feels like it's been these 3 weeks seem as if they've been a year. It's been really busy and really crazy, and I can't wait for spring break. I can't wait till the end of the
spring
semester.
Break. Fall break. Oh my god.
Fall break. I don't even know. I don't even know what season it is. Honestly,
I hope you have a break
worst.
coming before spring. My goodness.
Me too. Oh my gosh, it's been so busy. Yeah. I don't know. Feeling very pressed for time on every single thing. So it sucks, but I don't know. This is the life that I chose. So
yes,
here we go.
I remember those days.
Yeah, it's hard. Dean, what have you been doing?
I've not been doing that. I don't have classes anymore, so I'm just in like orbiting PhD status right now. But I've been finding all kinds of other ways to fill up my time, I guess. So the journalism thing's been cool. I wrote a cool article that, well, I think it's cool. And that got published at Tikkun, which is a neat like Jewish interfaith progressive magazine. Yeah, that's like the big haps, I guess. Is I was glad to finish that and find someone to publish it instead of just putting it on my blog somewhere.
Congrats.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a neat thing. Also, I mentioned this to you both before we did this, but I met with the Ontario leader of the Communist Party of Canada and another friend of mine, Jay, who's a member of them too. So exploring that, maybe I'm gonna take the plunge, I guess. I've been going to like casual meetings, like karaoke events and, you know, book sales and stuff, like very church-like activities. So yeah, who knows? Maybe I'll get baptized sooner than later.
Yeah. The Communist Party of Canada has a very cool Twitter logo.
They do.
That's the one thing I really like about them. I mean,
yeah, it's like half of it is a gear and half of it is a sheaf of wheat. So
yeah,
farming and industry. That's what they're all about, I guess. Communism.
That good communist.
Yeah, they're all about branding, right? Yeah.
That's right. Katie, what have you been up to?
Well, I'm on sabbatical this semester, so I'm not teaching, and I'm a generally boring person. So it's kind of been, I mean, I don't know, I was trying to think of like, what did I even do? I don't know, the seasons change. Well, yeah, I'm in like Pennsylvania. So it went from like summer to fall, like really abruptly. I usually get cranky at fall because winter's coming, but I don't know, I'm digging it this year. So I don't know what's up with that. And
Nice.
a cousin of mine was like lives in Florida and was going to potentially be hit by the hurricane. So I was doing a lot of Weather Channel watching, but it ended up being way not as bad as I thought. So that's like the event of my life, I guess, was something happening in someone else's life. So I don't know.
Yeah.
That's okay. It could be worse. My in-laws just came here to visit, and they are snowbirds with a house in Florida. So we were doing the same thing all weekend, basically.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's a good time.
Did everything end up okay for them, or?
I guess the last I heard was like the wind, like I don't know, blew some of their doors off, but that was it. And I guess the rain is supposed to be a problem, but I don't know. I haven't heard back on that, so I guess no news is good news. I would suspect if something really bad happened, they would probably call us and tell us. So
Probably.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
So that's good. Anyway, that your life isn't full of bad events.
That's true.
I don't know. I'm looking for the silver lining. That's all.
That's true. Absolutely. No, boring is good sometimes.
Well, let's talk about something that is not boring, which is a book that you wrote. How's that for a segue? I've been practicing segues.
I'll take it.
So you wrote this book, Fugitive Saints. It is very good. Also, Fortress Press gave us review copies of it, which is very nice of them. So
Hey,
I don't know.
Yeah, super cool.
Thank you, Fortress Press.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'm going to toss it over to Matt to ask our sort of stock opening question.
Okay.
Yeah, so Fortress Press gave us these really cool review copies, and the book is very neat, and Dean and I both are really digging it. But not everyone that listens to our podcast has read the book yet. Obviously, that's how that works. But maybe you could kind of give us like an elevator pitch for the project overall, so that like listeners can be on the same page. So if you had to describe the book to someone who had never heard of it, what would you tell them?
I think I'd probably start by saying when I was getting my master's degree, I heard about this saint named Peter Claver. I'd never heard about him before. He was a Spanish guy that was working in 17th century Colombia. And, you know, what I heard about him is that he was kind of this defender of enslaved people down there and kind of really ahead of his time and just like really heroic. And I was so excited. I like ran, you know, I was getting my master's degree, so I was a nerd, right? We already know that. So I like ran to the university library to check out like all the, you know, the books, which hagiographies about him I could find. And I like started reading and I was like really took the wind out of me because the person I heard about was not at all the person being depicted. And these are the hagiographies, right? Which hagiographies are basically, you know, things written about someone to say, look how saintly they are, right? So these weren't people trying to bash him. These were people like, this guy's awesome. And that really kind of stuck with me and kind of led to a sort of an obsession now. Basically, it really started with this Peter Claver thing, like trying to reconcile what all these good people, right? Like, among Catholics, he really is kind of the go-to saint for racial justice or, defending the rights of Black people. So, all these kind of Catholics, particularly white Catholics in the United States who are on board with racial justice, really good intentions. They love Peter Claver because we've all been told a story about him that isn't really true, right? So that was that investigation. And it kind of led me to see that there's kind of a thread here, specifically with respect to, I guess, saints of slavery in the Americas. There's really only two that have some sort of relationship. That's Peter Claver, right, who was the white Spanish man supposedly ministering to Black slaves. And then there was Martin de Porres, who was the term mulatto, half Black, half white Peruvian, who, that's it, right? So he himself wasn't a slave. His mom was a slave. And basically, the point of the book is what do we do when kind of are with pasts that we now might want to disavow, or we might recognize are sinful or problematic. I know problematic, that's like a problematic term. And kind of what do we do? How do we rehabilitate our past, right? So my argument in this is what I think has happened is, each generation, typically white Catholics, they try to turn to these saints because it's really all we have, right? We don't have a lot of pro-Black saints in the Catholic Church. They kind of remake them each generation to fit in with kind of the liberal, and I use that neutrally, not pejoratively or anything, the kind of liberal Catholic view of race at the time, right? So, and so basically what I want to say is rather, we need to stop doing that, right? Stop trying to reinvent them kind of in our image, right? Basically my thesis is we remember them not as they were, but as we wish the church was. And then we just need to admit that, even not necessarily the people, but the reasons they were canonized to begin with maybe weren't what we thought they were. And rather than trying to rehabilitate these men or turn them into heroes, particularly Claver, we just need to kind of just reckon with the fact that, wow, like this is disturbing. We need to just basically let ourselves be disturbed. I mean, so that's kind of one half of the argument, which I know that was a really long elevator ride, probably only if we had been stuck in the elevator, but that's...
They always are. You might be surprised to find out.
Yeah.
That's great, though. I mean, we'll have time to kind of expand on some of the stuff in the next however many minutes we have together. But maybe one way we could kind of get into it is just by getting some of the scholarly research that you borrowed from and used on the table. So one thing that you deal with a lot is a kind of constellation of themes and thinkers associated with Afro-pessimism. Yeah. And that's I feel like kind of commonly misunderstood and underappreciated also kind of group of contemporary scholars. So could you give this is a very unfair explanation, but I'm going to ask you to do it anyway. Can you give just a short explanation of what that's about? What is Afro-pessimism, as far as you can sort of say something about that? And then what do you think makes it so useful? How did you come across it to do a project like this, that sort of a thing?
Yeah, so I think the term Afro-pessimism, I think it's kind of what people call them. I don't know that they have ever called themselves that. It's basically, and I'm sure I'm going to forget someone, a scholar named Saidiya Hartman, Fred Moten, Frank Wilderson, Jared Sexton. They kind of all have, to varying degrees, kind of based their thought on Frantz Fanon. And basically they're not working in concert, right? I mean, but their kind of basic, I guess, argument is that anti-Black racism in particular, first of all, because it kind of stems from slavery, right? It is different from other forms of racisms or even sexism or homophobia or whatever, right? Or class oppression. Now, they're not even necessarily saying worse or better, just it's a different species, right? Because it kind of takes the shape of slavery. So that's the one part of it. The second part of it is that anti-Black racism, so this is the pessimism part, it is more deeply embedded, and they're talking about the United States mostly, but I think you could maybe think about the Americas in general. I don't know. Anti-Black racism is more deeply embedded kind of into the fabric of the United States and people who are U.S. Americans than we like to think, right? So it can't just be kind of stamped out with some sort of reform movement. So that's the pessimism, right? They kind of say, so other identities, even non-Black people of color or white women or lesbian and gay people, that they kind of argue their way in both in terms of citizenship rights, kind of explicitly and implicitly over and against Black people, right? So Black people are the out against which everyone else creates the in. So I don't know how well that was of an explanation, but I kind of got into them because Saidiya Hartman has a book called Lose Your Mother. Everyone should read it, which is it's an astonishingly well written, brilliant. I mean, it's just a powerful book. And she has this phrase. She says, it's not really that we're living in the aftermath of Black slavery, but the afterlife of slavery. And I don't know, I kind of encountered that at the end when I was writing my dissertation, which was on, white supremacy. And it just kind of clicked for me. It kind of sometimes you come across something and you're like, you haven't thought that exact thought before, but you almost have thought that thought before, right? It was the thought.
Yeah, for sure.
And it just kind of helped me synthesize things that, and just kind of, pull things together. And so that kind of was a lens, kind of some of their insights, I put sort of my own spin on it, I guess, through which I was then kind of using to kind of help us see maybe why some of the things about the way we remember these saints, that some things might seem fine or good, actually looked at through the lens of Afro-pessimism, we can see actually are disturbing or perpetuate anti-Black racism, whatever you want to say, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Afro-pessimism is definitely not a term that I am super familiar with. Dean was even explaining it to me last night a little bit more. Anyway, so this is super helpful and I think a great explanation of what's going on here and why this is important. So your book is, focusing on these Catholic saints who have a pretty, troubled past and also tough reappropriation. And I think that's great work. Though I wonder if you think, okay, so not everyone that listens to this podcast is necessarily Catholic.
Sure.
I'm not. And I still think that this is super cool. This is cool work because I like knowing things, but I'm also, a nerd and knowing things is cool. But do you think that there's a good reason why people who are not Catholic, people in the larger Christian community should have, should be invested in this and find this worthwhile?
Sure. Obviously this is a self-interested question, right? Trying to explain why people should care about my, right? But so whatever, take it with a grain of salt. But I guess the larger question, I think absolutely any country, any institution, any religious community, I don't want to water it down too much, but has things in their past which are not as they should have been. Even families, right? My goodness, we, and so the question of what do we do with this past, right? And it's not a one size fits all. It's going to depend upon the situation. I think something Catholic theology, maybe, Protestant theology too, something we've kind of been starting to do well past 20, 30 years, I think, especially with feminism, is finding those forgotten kind of heroes, right? And retrieving them. I think that's important, but some things can't be retrieved. Some things can't be made nice, and you actually do more harm when you try to make something, that wasn't nice look nice, if that makes sense. Right. So yeah. I think in the United States, what do we do to, Thomas Jefferson, how do we remember these people? So, I think this question of memory, we're all people, we're sinful, whatever, there's all fallible. What do we do with unpleasant, evil, unjust past?
Yeah, that's cool. I guess I just want to make sure that Protestants don't feel like they're off the hook or something, because these are Catholic, Catholic folks. We're still, we still got a lot of bad stuff going on.
No, I haven't done as much research, of course, but I would say, another kind of one of my insights that I talk about in this book and in another book is kind of that, white people, non-Black people are kind of habituated into anti-Blackness, right? It's the air we breathe. And to not be that way takes a concerted effort, so Catholicism, like a lot of the Protestant religions, it contributed to creating a culture that was anti-Black, but at the same time, it was also conditioned and habituated by that culture. And so the same would be true for Protestant, any socialist, Marxist, any feminist, it doesn't, so it's not so it's not Catholics are uniquely this, that, and the other, right? It's that what I would say is there are maybe some specifically Catholic ways that Catholicism accommodated itself or resonated with anti-Black racism that might have been different than some of the ways that Protestantism, Methodists or whoever were vulnerable to or aligned with anti-Black racism, right? Does that make sense? But no, I don't think there's not really, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to overgeneralize. I mean, like the Quakers were pretty like ahead of the curve with abolitionism, right? But I don't know. Maybe they're off the hook. I'm not really sure. But no. It's not like it's not like there's something specifically evil about Catholicism.
A term that you used a second ago, and I think is an important one to maybe parse out, is the word retrieval.
Oh yeah.
Could you talk about that for a second? I'm interested in the ways that like our memory is shaped like what we think is possible in terms of cultural imagination. So I wonder what you'd have to say or how you'd explain retrieval to some of our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, again, memory, our individual lives, our families, whatever. I mean, sainthood is interesting in the Catholic Church because I'm not saying sainthood is false, right? I'm not trying to say something conspiratorial here, but in a sense, sainthood is our memory of these people, right? It's how the church has chosen to remember them, for better or for worse. And I think for lots of reasons, some of the things have nothing to do with the Catholic Church, right? It could literally even just be who got to testify at the beatification hearings, right? Who had access to, who could write, who could read and write, who was considered, who got to ask the questions or who got to write the questions. So I think, and this is kind of like an old insight, right? This is not at all me on the cutting edge of anything, that, there's history as in what happened and history as in what we remember or think happened. That second definition of history is not, a lot of stuff gets left out, right? And a lot of to do with who has power, this, that, and the other. So retrieval is just trying to find those, you could almost imagine it's like I took my trash out, I dumped my trash out and I realized, oh my gosh, I threw my like grandma's necklace in the trash, so you go back in the trash and you're picking through where is that, right? I mean, that's kind of basically something I feel like Christian theologians and other, and historians have been doing. Like, what was that? Who was that person in that past, right? Or that idea or that way of being Catholic or Christian or whatever that just did not make it into the history books or was not considered important. That's kind of like retrieval, I guess, if that makes sense.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. That's so good.
Yeah, like a minute ago, you were talking about how you didn't want to say there's something very specific about Catholicism uniquely as opposed to every other chain of memory or tradition or whatever that makes it particularly susceptible to anti-Black supremacy, as you talk about it in the book. But that being said, could we talk about like some of the specific ways that Catholicism did kind of find its own Catholic ways of supporting those hegemonies? So, I mean, you spend a lot of time really culling like all these archival documents about, what are these people like? How were they, interacting with people around them and remembered it immediately and then later on? I think that's like really helpful work. I think one thing that really troubled me was especially the Peter Claver chapter where you were talking about the specific ways in which, for example, he like used the sacraments in order to bring Africans into this new sort of pseudo welcoming community precisely so that they could be excluded. Could you just like give us maybe a rundown about like one of the ways that he did that or one of the ways that, you've identified that logic happening in Catholicism at large?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons why 99% of people who kind of hear the tagline about who Peter Claver was, why they think he's amazing and relevant to the current time, because the main thing he's renowned for, in addition to his moniker of slave of the slaves, is that he supposedly baptized 300,000 Africans or something like that, right? And in kind of the contemporary kind of Catholic, at least here in the States, kind of way of thinking, it has to do with Catholic social teaching. One of our big buzzwords is marginalization, right? That's kind of one of the big ways we think of social evil, right? Marginalized peoples. Right. So then, there's and then speaking about lesbian and gays in the church, there, so inclusion is the goal, right? Family, all that kind of stuff, right? And there's a tendency to see racism as exclusion, right? Which certainly it can be. So then when we hear that, Peter Claver baptized slaves, right? He included them in the church, right? And of course, baptism is awesome, right? If you're a person of faith, baptism is great. So we think, wow, there was somebody who was standing. So then, we kind of, then all these kind of modern assumptions, we don't realize their modern assumptions follow from that, right? We say, well, if he baptized the slaves, he knew they had souls, which is true. And if he knew that they had souls, he knew that they were equal to white people. If he knew they were equal to white people, then he thought slavery was bad and they were being mistreated, right? Yes, those are all things that would follow today, right? And it's kind of interesting because, forgive me, I hope this isn't too tangential. A lot of people accuse me of being unfair to Peter Claver because I'm judging him by modern standards, right? When in reality, a lot of the reason why we think he's awesome is because we are importing these kind of modern notions of inclusion and spiritual quality, right? But I mean, for a long time in the church, thinking that someone was spiritually equal, right, like that, meaning they would go to heaven, they can be saved, had no relationship to whether thinking they were socially or politically equal, right? Okay, so there's that. There's kind of that. Other thing is too, and I don't know how it is for you guys, but here in the States, we have a very kind of oversimplified, overly economic understanding of slavery, right? That slavery was like just economic. It's just about like a form of labor exploitation, which it certainly was for most of the time. But really, slavery is like a very perverse and violent form of belonging and actually intimacy in a weird way. And you guys can ask me more about that. But so basically, because we don't really, we kind of have this overly narrow understanding of slavery, you know, and we have these notions that, yeah, today, if you think people have souls, you do tend to put all these other, you know, positive things around it. We don't realize the way that baptism actually could be an ally of kind of a pro-slavery mindset, right? Because it's a way of incorporating these African women and men into a society in which to be Spanish was to be Catholic was to be Spanish, right? Or under Spanish control. I don't know if that makes sense. So that's kind of like the main reason why baptism, despite the fact that objectively baptism is awesome, right? You know, objectively should be liberating, should bring life, new life, should bring salvation and all those things connected, why it kind of did the opposite, right? In fact, it wasn't always perfectly followed, but certainly in the medieval period throughout quote unquote Christendom, I hate to use that word, I can't think of anything better for now, you know, there was a connection between baptism and freedom, like actual freedom, like I'm not a slave, to the point that if someone was baptized, they weren't, you know, there was a recognition that they shouldn't be a slave. And, you know, there were negatives to that. Of course, that's why, you know, Christians tend to own Muslim and Jewish slaves, on and on. But in the, you know, English colonizers in North America, the Dutch, Spanish, I mean, it's funny, all these drama that, you know, the Protestants and Catholics were having around the Reformation, somehow all of them came to the same conclusion about baptism, which was all of a sudden now baptism didn't lead to freedom when it came to Black people, right? And now here we are in the 21st century. And that's something we have to learn. Oh, slaves, if you were baptized, you could not be a slave, right? I don't know if that makes sense. But in Claver's, so yes, ideally in baptizing the slaves, Claver then should have said, now they can't be slaves. It was the opposite. He thought, well, these people cannot rule themselves. They can only be saved if they're under white people's power. So I'm baptizing them as slaves in order to save them, if that makes sense, right? So things got totally turned upside down.
Yeah, that's interesting. Going back to kind of what Matt was talking about earlier with respect to Catholic and Protestant ways of relating to all this, I'm just reading right now Abram X. Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. And I just got through like the sort of colonial or the early colonial history. And it is really fascinating. I mean, he identifies the same kind of logic among Protestants. And I guess like it's funny because initially he says slave owners didn't want people to be like, they didn't want missionaries to come because they didn't want their slaves to be baptized. Hence it would lead to, you know, all these slaves being free, and they can't have that. Like it would ruin their economy and it would ruin their actual life that they built on anti-blackness. But then over time, like some really inventive theologians were like, well, actually like being baptized just makes you, you know, a better slave than you were before. So yeah, it's weird that like this technology of slavery and, you know, these theological ways in which it gets legitimated kind of cross all ecumenical lines in that sense when it comes to Black slaves. I
mean, definitely something, you know, it's hilarious, you know, quotation marks, how just, you know, despite these very intense disagreements, wars fought, you know, Dutch people, Spanish people, or Portuguese, English, whatever, French, they all came to the same conclusion about Black people, right? I mean, that's, I think, and so, I mean, so that's again, Afro-pessimists. They're like, yeah, see, that's the foundation of the world is anti-Blackness, right? That's like what Afro-pessimists would say, right? People disagree about everything but that. You know, that's basically what they would say, right? Even to the point where we could have a war over it or something, right? But there was an agreement that Black people should be slaves just for being Black, and other people shouldn't be slaves, right?
Well, Katie, I saw the other day on Twitter you had this really cool thread going on about Peter Claver and the Pope. Could you talk us through that? Because I, again, a Protestant who knows very little about the saints, found that thread really interesting. Could you kind of like talk us through like the controversy and your take on it?
Yeah. So Peter Claver also was a Jesuit. which I know a lot of people probably know, heard the word Jesuit, but it's like an order of priests, within the Catholic Church. And Pope Francis is a Jesuit, and that was like a huge big deal because it was like the first Jesuit Pope. So he was visiting the country of Colombia this past weekend. And as a part of that, he stopped at the tomb, Peter Claver's tomb in the city of Cartagena, Colombia, which was where he, his ministry was. And, again, from the perspective, for the dominant narrative of Peter Claver, this made perfect sense. Pope Francis is a Jesuit. Peter Claver was a Jesuit. Peter Claver was working in South America. Obviously, the Pope is from South America. Peter Claver is portrayed as someone who was a defender of like the downtrodden and the lowly, right? He was also a pastoral person, supposedly someone who's willing to get his hands dirty and all this. Obviously, Pope Francis is that way too. And so he was kind of visiting. There was a scheduled visit to Pope Francis's tomb. I don't know, I feel like sometimes people think like the Pope's like all he does is like make rules and like boss people around, and I mean, I guess that can happen, but certainly with like John Paul II's papacy, but maybe even before that, certainly with Francis, it's a lot about kind of like these symbolic gestures, not like empty symbolism, right? But these kind of, washing people's feet, right? So that's another big thing like the Pope does is kind of like signal like who the church should be, like, or what it would mean to be a Catholic. So the big deal, him visiting this tomb. And I kind of just like I just kind of knew that people were going to kind of the kind of old story about Peter Claver that I'm pushing back. I just knew it was really going to be trumped out in hyperdrive, right? So I was just kind of trying to lay out a few things as to basically the person that we think Peter Claver is, that's not who he was. So I was just kind of like, saying some things to that nature, right? I don't know. I don't know what specifically you want to know about it, but I was just basically, I knew that, it would be a buzz. Peter Claver would be the buzz, and Pope Francis as a kind of like Peter Claver, which I said kind of cheekily. I was like, this is actually the worst thing you could say about Pope Francis, right? Which of course, anyways, so that's what that was. My futile attempt of having my research have some sort of effect on the world. I don't know.
Yeah. What was the response from that thread? Were people like interested, or did you get lots of negative replies? Like
the word lots, you have to keep in mind, like there's not really lots of people that would see my Twitter feeding in the first place, but
sure.
Not yet.
It was like mixed. It was mixed. I mean, a lot of the people that follow me, as we all do on Twitter, there's like a lot of like sorting, so they're probably already kind of most of them have a similar worldview as me. So a lot of people kind of were open to it. And then I think then there was a second wave of people who understandably were like really, really upset and didn't want to believe that this was true. Right. So they were kind of like skeptical, right. Which, hey, we all should be skeptical, right? Like I'm just a random person telling you things, they were kind of like, prove it to me. Like, how can this be? I think kind of the main thing was, I don't understand like how this is hard for me to believe that the church would canonize someone like this. Right. I'm like, exactly. Right. I mean, that's why, we should be disturbed, right? It should be heartbreaking. It shouldn't make sense, so I'm certainly very sympathetic to people being like almost angry, like this can't be true. This can't be true. Or like you have to be misrepresenting something. And maybe I am, right. I mean, like, please, but
no, it was very funny. I think one of your Twitter interlocutors was whoever runs the Maryknoll Brothers and Fathers Twitter account, which was very strange. But it was funny because they said something sort of ironically like, I can't wait to hear your take on Junipero Serra, which is very funny because you address that in the book, like in the beginning as like exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about. So it's weird how it's such a live issue, I guess. Yeah,
and that's another thing too for the Junipero Serra. Again, people might not know who he is. There's a man named George Tinker. He's a Native American Catholic theologian. He already like wrote a book about it. So please, everybody read his stuff. Yeah, and his book was kind of an inspiration for my book too. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely it's an ongoing thing. And the Junipero Serra, so basically he was also a Spanish missionary out in, I think, what's now California. And it's kind of like a similar relationship with indigenous people as maybe Claver with African people. But the difference is he was just very recently canonized, right? So that is it's kind of a very fresh wound. And given that, in the United States, so many Catholics in the United States are Hispanic, Latino. So that was a very like emotionally, it's kind of like the church's like the American Catholic version of like, what do we do with statues to Confederate generals?
Right.
I mean, obviously that's my I guess very partisan take on the Junipero Serra thing, right? But it's a very emotionally charged thing for Catholics in the U.S.
Yeah, I think that works though. I mean, that's maybe a helpful analogy. It's just the saints are the story of the Catholic Church. I mean, there's so much bound up there. So of course, people who disagree with that story or find problems with it, I mean, people might be upset about that.
And we do. I mean, as saints for better or for worse, you think of Our Lady of Guadalupe, right? There's an example of she wasn't just some person, or Juan Diego, the indigenous man to whom the Virgin Mary appeared in what's now Mexico. It's not just she was this random apparition, right? Or it wasn't just Juan Diego was this individual who was like really awesome. It's somehow this is obviously a historical process, but Our Lady of Guadalupe and Juan Diego and their kind of encounter is seen as like kind of a symbol of who like Mexican people think they are, right? Or and who they are. I'm not like disputing that at all, right? So there is a sense of corporate identity, like they're mascots. Like I'm not saying that to trivialize it, but they're mascots, right? They're expressions of who we think we are, right? I mean, that's why there's saints. A certain town has a patron saint, right? I mean, they're very much like expressions of who we are. So it's a very, very emotional, not just because kind of the credibility of the Catholic Church is being called into question, but like we like it's our identity is being attacked, right?
Yeah, this is a completely side note thing, but just on that note, I was looking at all the Zapatistas have someone who works with the Zapatistas has this store where they like sell Zapatista stuff. And I was looking through it, especially after the earthquake in Chiapas. And there was this awesome t-shirt that is the Virgin Mary, sort of old-looking icon, standard, whatever, the kind of thing you'd see in any, like, tourist shop, I guess. But she has, like, I don't know, like, basically a Zapatista bandana, and it says, like, Our Lady of the Oppressed in Spanish, and I was like, that's, like, the coolest thing that I've ever seen. But it's also exactly why, I guess, sort of the way in which the church remembers itself is so dangerous, because it is that powerful in a way. Yeah,
I mean, that's a good example. Like, the fact that kind of we can reappropriate a memory of a saint or a historical figure or whoever over time, I'm not saying that change is necessarily bad, right? Like, I mean,
right.
Like Mexico did not exist when, in the 1500s so it's not like, that we can't update it as we change our memory of the saint, but it's just that we have to be aware, right, that happens, right? And we have to be willing to confront that, if our corporate identity is messed up, well, understandably, the thing that we are, I don't know, the thing that we want to express that identity might be, is going to reflect the things that are messed up about us, right? So, right. Yeah, I mean, the Zapatista, I mean, there's, I can't think of any other examples, but or even the fact that Pope John Paul II named Our Lady of Guadalupe the patron saint of all of the Americas. Right now, there's an example of this kind of taking on. It's not necessarily bad, right? So my beef with the way you remember people like Peter Claver isn't that we don't remember him exactly like they did back then, right? It's just that kind. It's based on a lie, right?
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about just that universalizing principle, I think we could call it, in Christianity, which can be dangerous, I guess, in ways that we've explored in past episodes. And I wonder what you would think about this. So we had this guest on a little while ago, Amaria Armstrong, who's very cool, to talk about a paper that she wrote about Paul and his universalizing tendencies in Galatians being kind of the seedbed for exclusionary tendencies later on in Christian history. So it's the very kind of universalism that makes it a problem. And I was reading Freedom is a Constant Struggle by Angela Davis, and I just pulled this quote out because it made me, when I was reading your book, it made me think of it. So she says, more often than not, universal categories have been clandestinely racist. Any critical engagement with racism requires us to understand the tyranny of the universal. So I just couldn't help thinking that as I was reading kind of you retelling these narratives, because there's this way in which baptizing slaves or even like any of the sacraments, I guess, that are meant to symbolize this sort of unity among Christians, those are the very things that cut those people off from their own kind of networks of solidarity, their own histories, and that sort of thing. So how do you think, like, Catholicism is supposed to be the church universal, and other Christianities have their own ways of kind of talking about the universality of salvation or Christianity or whatever. How do you think that universalism, I guess, contributes to these narratives of exclusion and material practices of exclusion. I don't know. It seems it's just like a hard thing I've been wrestling with a lot, I guess.
I mean, yeah. I mean, that's like a kind of a huge. Obviously people can't see me. I just like put my head in my hand. It's like a huge question. Yeah. I mean, we love to some people love to pit everything on Paul. It's all Paul's fault. It's all Augustine's fault. Who knows? Where did it go wrong? I don't know. I don't know. I'm trying to. I think. I mean, I guess speaking of universality, I'll speak specifically of this question of Peter Claver, anti-blackness. I think something. Okay, well, with the baptism thing, bringing people in, it wasn't. I don't know. This is a really hard question, just because there's so many kind of factors too. I don't know. I think as I get older, I'm skeptical that any one theological idea necessarily leads to good or bad actions or outcomes, right? I guess I'm increasingly, I guess my kind of theory is that we can look back and see, oh, there's the seed of that evil thing that happened later, right? We could even look at anti-Semitism, which we know that Christian anti-Judaism has played a big role in that. Yes, looking back now, we can say, oh, wow, Gospel of John. Oh, yes, it's all makes sense now. And here we are, 2000 years later, Hitler, right? But at the same time, one could have imagined a different society in which Christians could have had really negative views about the religious beliefs of Jews, and it wouldn't have led to this kind of intermittent 2 millennia of persecution, right? Does that make sense? So I don't know. I think the problem I think the problem with the Peter Claver and the baptism, it's not so much that in that time, people thought, oh, if you weren't Catholic, you were going to hell, right? I mean, because, I think from our perspective, it's easy to be like, oh, that was the problem. These people took it too seriously, right? I think the problem was that Peter Claver thought black slavery was good. I mean, that I said
right.
I'm giving a cop-out answer. That was the problem, right? And there were people throughout history that had, equally sincere, fervent belief that if you weren't Catholic, you were going to hell, and they didn't enslave people, right? I mean, so I think the fact that Peter Claver thought that literally slavery was freedom and the social death of slavery was the new life and the salvation for black people. I mean, once you do that, it's over. And I think the fact that that baptism in particular and the Eucharist to a certain degree is so easy to get co-opted, right? It's because, this word belonging, I don't know how it plays out in other languages, but in English, I mean, belong, it's such an ambiguous word, right? It's all right there, right? We say, I mean, if you're in love with someone, you call them my love, my wife, my husband, my sweetie, right? I mean, that's a belonging, that's a possession, my child, right? Belonging to God, my God. But then slavery, my slave, right? And baptism also is that question of to whom do we belong, right? Belonging to Christ implies belonging to a certain community. And so I think it's and I think the thing I don't think we moderns with our, we recognize marginalization and all this is bad. I don't think we're sensitive enough to how dangerous belonging is, right? And so that's why I kind of turned to fugitivity, basically fugitives, right? Is that precisely because a fugitive refuses to belong, right? And manages not to belong, right? It not only refuses to belong, but actually succeeds in not belonging. And I think that actually, and again, because we over universalize, we want to just say, oh, racism, it's all the same, right? Hate, it's hate. I hate you or something. When I think something I'm trying to do in my work and pessimists are trying to do is say, actually, anti-black racism, it's not that it's completely different from other forms of racism, but it's its own thing, right? It's not a one-size-fit-all racism, right? White people, white supremacy doesn't actually treat, let's say, African Americans and indigenous people the same. We don't. Right? We actually don't. I mean, we treat them both horribly. And so that, to me, I think that when we say, oh, racism is hate, racism is exclusion, in the case of anti-black racism, it's actually been perverse, forced belonging. White people refuse to let black people belong to themselves, right? We want them to be where, in a weird way, slavery, owning another person, right? It may seem like the slavery period and the Jim Crow, the racial segregation, the coloreds only, whites only, water fountain, those might seem like opposites, right? But they're actually a continuation, right? Because in the first, whites were, if I keep you close, I'll have power over you. If I keep you, then in the segregation period, it was, I'll keep you far by having power over you, right? So white people always want to put black people where they want to put them. So that's why I like fugitivity, or the kind of the both historical reality and the metaphor of the fugitive, because no, a fugitive is like literally going and doing and being whoever he or she wants to be, right? And is fleeing from that kind of forced, perverse belonging, right? So I don't know, that's like a long-winded thing. So, but yeah, that's my answer to the universalism thing.
No, that's really helpful. Okay, so the term fugitive then plays kind of like a specific role here within like the milieu of Afro-pessimism, and it's a part of the idea of the fugitive is definitely part of like the proposals I think that you make about the church towards the end of the book. Okay, so the proposals are these as we've characterized them here. So like that the church should abandon the search for white heroes for this foreseeable future. That the church should cease praising those like white Catholics who have already been exalted as racial heroes, like Peter Claver. And then the third one is when contemporary Catholics wish to invoke the memory of Catholic racial righteousness, they should instead call upon black Catholics, but they can't do just uncritically that. So those are the three sort of suggestions you make, and I think those are all very cool. So how do these proposals, I guess, help us in thinking through the idea of the fugitive or the role of the fugitive within the story of the church in like a hagiographical kind of way? So how do these three proposals help us like unmake our habits of racism?
I mean, yeah, it's true. I mean, I don't know, like, you know, a critic of ethicists is like, we're really good at being like very specific about like what's wrong, you know, but our like, how do we fix it is like super vague or whatever. And I know I'm guilty of that. It's more, I think, kind of a way of thinking. And so, I mean, this is kind of the paradox of fugitivity, because I think another thing that can happen, and in the United States, we see this with like Martin Luther King, right? Some people say, on the one hand, yes, the fact that we have a federal holiday for Martin Luther King is like awesome, but there's kind of like an underside to it as well, because now everybody can say that they like love Martin Luther King. So in one sense, he kind of gets, watered down to the lowest common denominator of like racial morality. But then two, everybody like the fact that actually when he was alive, he was deeply hated by most white people is like forgotten. And so basically I think what the church needs to do right now is like, we need to remember that kind of a metaphor here. We need to remember that in the 1960s, we would have the chances, more likely than not, we would have hated Martin Luther King. Right. And so, analogously, right, we need to remember that we are the church that canonized. We've canonized someone who thought slavery was Black people's freedom. Right. But we have yet to canonize a Black person who actually like thought freedom was freedom. Right. And so we need to just like recognize that that's who we are. And we need to also be careful, because in finding these kind of fugitive heroes, or even Black people who stayed within the institutional church, we almost like shouldn't canonize them. Right. Because if we do, we're actually like bringing them back inside. We're almost like holding them captive, or, we're making them captive. In a weird way, right. If someone's a fugitive and then you like claim them as your own, then they're not a fugitive anymore. So basically, I guess we need to learn that we are the church that makes fugitivity necessary sometimes, if that makes sense. And precisely because I said that, I think it was inclusion that is the kind of underlying thread of evil of Catholic anti-Blackness is why, and along with that, the fact that Black people need white saviors, socially, spiritually, whatever. We need to recognize that Black people don't need us. Right. And in a sense, Black people can choose us if they want to. Right. I don't know. So I don't know. That's kind of like vague, but it's a weird of recognizing these people, but not claiming them as our own. Recognizing, no, we're the church for whom that person's holiness could not be recognized as holiness.
Yeah. To me, there's, I don't know, the line I'm drawing here is between, I guess, what you're doing in this book and what like lots of decolonial theorists are doing, especially in terms of like the Western epistemic hierarchy. Like, okay, to make your thinking as like a teacher, to make like your syllabi and curriculum like diverse, right? You need to do more than just add diverse voices, but like think through who is like a legitimate source, and like where they come from and that kind of stuff. So it seems like before we can even like call on some voices in our conversation, we have to give them real legitimate power and think of them as having something unique to say that might challenge sort of the overarching systems of oppression.
Yeah, I mean, for example, like during Peter Claver's time in Colombia, there were these kind of settlements of self-emancipated Black people called palenques. And he was actually, and the Spanish were always trying to like conquer them and get rid of them. And Peter Claver, one of the palenques was raided by the Spanish, and of course its leaders were, put to death in the Inquisition because, running away was evil and all of this stuff. And Peter Claver actually acted as confessor to them. Oh gosh, I totally forgot where I was going with this as I was explaining the Palenque thing. Where was I going with this? What were you saying? Oh, I got it. So in one of those in Palenques, there was evidence that there was like a kind of a Catholicism was being practiced of some sort, just among Black people. There weren't any like white priests or anything. And so it also would be like, for example, saying those, like there were Black saints. And I'm saying, in Catholicism, there's saints with a capital S, which would be people who have been recognized by the institutional church as a saint. But then the Catholic Church also recognizes lowercase saint would be like all holy people or any holy person who's like made it to heaven, right? So there's more saints with a lowercase s than there are capital case S. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there are Black Catholic saints, lowercase s, maybe in that Palenque, right? But elsewhere, whom we can never retrieve, right? They are literally lost to us. And lost to us means like they were in a sense a fugitive, right? Because for them to make themselves known to us would have been for them to no longer be free, right? That makes sense. So that's the thing we need to recognize in a sense, like there's a lot of people will never be able to be retrieved, right? We were not a church who could recognize the holiness we could not recognize Black holiness. I don't know. Yeah, I don't want to be too strong, but yeah.
Well, I don't know. I think in the book you use very strong language, and the strength of it is precisely that it is so kind of uncompromising in an important way. It's equal parts troubling and equal parts, I guess, like it makes sense, you know what I mean? Like clarifying, insofar as the problem isn't like this thing that you kind of keep running up against over and over. Like, how do you include appropriately, which always kind of ruins what should be happening somewhere else or something.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify, because I said this in the book, but like, in case someone's reading this, I don't want to say that there aren't amazing, holy Black Catholics that remained within the church or whatever. That's not what I'm saying. Right. I'm saying institutionally, the church can't recognize the people who stayed or couldn't leave the church until it learns to recognize the holiness of those who did, if that makes sense, right? So I'm not saying, like if you are a Black Catholic and, if you're a Black Catholic religious sister, I'm not at all saying that, right? I want to also make it clear that I'm singling out fugitivity just because I think it's especially kind of like antagonistic towards anti-Blackness. I don't want to say it's the only way that Black people have resisted anti-Blackness. I mean, just living can be resistance to anti-Blackness if you're a Black person, right? So because as a white person, it's really easy for me to sit here and be like, oh yeah, like running away, like there, but and the truth of the matter is, like, it was actually really, really difficult to run away, right? I mean, the whole society was stacked against you, right? So I'm not trying to make it sound, I'm not at all trying to make a moral, I'm not making a moral hierarchy among how Black people resisted or lived through anti-Blackness at all. That would be so evil and terrible. I'm just picking out fugitivity because it's especially, I think, antagonistic towards anti-Blackness, Catholic anti-Blackness in particular, if that makes sense.
That's a good caveat.
Yeah, because chances are, we like to pretend we're all like the dramatic heroes of history, but most of us, we wouldn't. So,
yeah. Well, sort of speaking of that, I guess, do you have any thoughts about like how the Catholic Church is responding to its legacy of white supremacy in the U.S.? Because this came up in Charlottesville. They famously released like a very dumb and bad statement right off the bat. And then they tried to repair that by releasing another one on Sunday, the next day. And then I was thinking about, I think I remember you seeing this as well when I was like following you on Facebook or on Twitter, sorry. But there were these Jesuits at Georgetown who tried to apologize for them, for Jesuits at Georgetown selling slaves and owning slaves a long time ago. And their, I guess, very soft excuse for reparations was like removing a name from a building and like giving like descendants of those slaves a discount on education, which I thought was like even worse than not apologizing or something. I don't know. What do you think about that as you're kind of watching it all from your vantage point?
Well, I think in general, like the general, putting aside the specific Georgetown thing for a second, I think the Catholic Church institutionally, I mean, and it's not that it hasn't ever done this, right? But just could, in general, institutionally start doing a better job acknowledging and naming the ways that, let me start over. I think sometimes the church thinks, for example, the Ferguson uprisings after, Michael Brown was murdered, the Archbishop of St. Louis, which is the nearest big city to Ferguson, he kind of released a statement kind of saying, okay, everybody calm down. Let's have a peaceful response. Like, violence isn't the way. And that's kind of, and I can talk about what's wrong with that, but I think the church tends to see itself as kind of like the referee, either like the referee,
right, that's right,
or like the good guy. I think the church needs to do a better job naming the ways that it actually helped to create this society in which it's possible for a person like Michael Brown to be like murdered, right? It actually is like responsible for that. And I think that would be a big starting point. I think there's a lot of, inside baseball about the United States, I think because of the history of the Catholic Church, it's becoming a Western and Southwestern church because of Latinos, Hispanics, but for white people, it was the Northeast, right? So I think white Catholics in the United States, we tend to think of ourselves as like, the descendants of, Italian immigrants and Irish immigrants, right? Who came here with like a nickel in their pocket, whatever, and worked their way up. And we tend to say, oh, racism was this like Southern thing, like Mississippi, Alabama. And so the Catholic Church wasn't really involved. And that's just like not remotely true. I could spend an hour talking about that. So I just think there's a lot of, there's a hyper-inflated sense of the church's goodness or maybe even its innocence. And I guess, I think in some ways, I think that the Catholic Church in the United States actually does like a pretty good job. I mean, the institution, not necessarily all the people in the pews, does a really good job with things like immigrants, or immigration reform or defending the rights of immigrants. Actually, I really do. I mean, I think in terms of an institution, and I mean, people out there tell me if I'm wrong, but in terms of institutions or groups in the United States, I think the Catholic Church is like right up there with the best. Obviously, it's very, regardless of what you think about it, it's very outspoken on abortion, right? That, it shouldn't be legal. It's very tepid on anti-Black racism and other forms of racism in particular, right? It tends to kind of just want everybody to be like, calm down. So yeah, I would like to see it, be a little bit more bold in denouncing the war on drugs or racial segregation. I don't know. Those just some ideas off the top of my head. So, I mean, the church has it in it. I mean, the Catholic Church in the United States institutionally can be rather prophetic. It's a little bit tepid institutionally on anti-Black racism. And certainly, again, indigenous people as well,
Yeah, that's a huge issue here in Canada, actually. Yeah, exactly.
To round out the conversation, we're going to have Katie read a quote from her book about Black fugitivity. So, Katie, take it away,
okay,
please.
Thank you. Black fugitivity points to a holy outside, but cautions us that we cannot access this space without destroying it. It presents us with a new moral goal. Rather than striving to be saviors of Black people, non-Black Catholics, like the Church itself, should instead help to facilitate their escape from anything that they believe holds them captive. Rather than either imposing community on Black people or expecting intimacy with them, Black fugitivity counsels non-Black people to make themselves worthy of an invitation from Black people. It further conditions them to accept that such an invitation may never arrive, instructing non-Black people to abandon even the slightest sense of entitlement in relation to Black people. The Church needs fugitives precisely because they do not need the Church.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. Like us on Facebook, give us the tweets on the Twitters, give us your faves, your likes on the SoundClouds, whatever social media you're on. Verify us on Verit, whatever you got time to do. It's actually really helpful, as Matt said. iTunes reviews give us some more visibility, so do that. You can also subscribe to a newsletter that we put out once a week called the Magnifisto, so the name should draw you in itself. We collect articles and book quotes and stuff that we're reading, and we try to give like a literal, 101, like here's a Christian thing or leftist thing you might not have known about. people seem to like it. It keeps going up in subscriptions every week, so you could be one of them, I guess. Also, if you liked what you heard and what you're reading or whatever, and you just want to support us because you're very kind and because we're doing this in our spare time, you can donate to us on Patreon. We have a link at our Twitter and on our website. That would be great. And as always, we'll just let the band The Illogical Spoon play us out. So see you next week. Thanks again, Katie Grimes, and to Fortress for sending us the book. Everybody should go buy a copy real quick. Goodbye.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. Beside what else are you gonna do?